a lot of people are saying that this is unconstitutional and that's why they're filing these lawsuits and motions. What would you say to someone saying that this measure is unconstitutional?
I think it's a six in one hand, half a dozen in the other hand proposition. The permit to purchase requirements, I think, will ultimately be upheld by the federal courts, but the ban on high capacity magazines, I think, will ultimately be struck down by the Supreme Courts. So both gun rights supporters and gun safety proponents will have something to celebrate and something to lament.
Yeah, and what does the process look like? You mentioned the Supreme Court's. I read something from the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office saying this might go to SCOTUS. I mean, what's the process look like from here?
So right now, just a week and a half ago, several individuals and a sheriff from Central Oregon filed a lawsuit in the federal court in Portland. That court will be hearing oral arguments on a motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction this upcoming Friday. It could take weeks or months for that court to ultimately decide whether Measure 114 is constitutional in whole or in part. It would then be appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which is headquartered in San Francisco. That process could easily take a year or more. And this is certainly the type of case that the United States Supreme Court would potentially be interested in. The Supreme Court is more interested in gun rights and the litigation surrounding regulations of firearms these days than other matters. But that would still be 3 or 4 years away, I think, at the earliest, before the Supreme Court would actually have this case before it.
So when somebody says that December 8th is the day it's going to be in effect, is that the case, do we think?
This is one of the more confounding questions about Measure 114. So the Oregon Constitution provides that initiatives go into effect 30 days after they are enacted or approved. The Secretary of State's office has taken the position that Election Day was the day that the measure was enacted or approved. What's interesting about that is not only that started the 30 days immediately on Election Day, but the election has not been certified. Oregon has, like every state, has a multi-week timeline for conducting, counting ballots, and certifying the election. The November election won't be certified by the Secretary of State until December 15th. And so it strikes me as odd to say that Measure 114 will be in effect before the actual election results have been certified by the Secretary of State. I think in some sense that's a moot point, because I suspect that the district court will enter a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction preventing Measure 114 from going into effect, both the permit to purchase requirement as well as the ban on high capacity magazines. The former, because the state police and no sheriff's office has the process in place to start taking applications, processing applications, let alone issuing the permit. And so it's kind of a fundamental principle of American law that you can't expect people to comply with an impossibility. And it's impossible to obtain a permit these days. So I think the federal court will almost certainly stop Measure 114 from going into effect, at least temporarily, while the state figures out how the permitting process is going to operate.
Yeah, and we've talked about the permitting process and the magazine ban. What about the database that people are concerned about, their right to privacy and all that?
Well, the devil's in the details. We'll have to see what the state police say in the regulations implementing Measure 114. I suspect that there will be privacy and confidentiality protections in those regulations that the database, for instance, won't be made public so that any individual can go online and find out who owns what firearms. I think if those provisions weren't inserted, I think that's something the U.S. Supreme Court would be concerned about. The Supreme Court has made it clear that that restrictions on the ability to acquire firearms are constitutional. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh especially concurred in the New York case this past June to emphasize that point. But that's not a blank check to impose any and all possible restrictions. And so, again, the devil's going to be in the details as to just exactly what the state police say in the regulations as to what the database looks like and what levels of confidentiality there are in it.
Yeah, and the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office also made it seem like he wasn't just defending Oregon or Oregonian gun owners, but gun owners countrywide in case Measure 114 is found constitutional and everything goes through, that it would allow other states to pass similar things. So, could you go into what this looks like if Measure 114 doesn't pass for other states and their gun control laws?
Well, Measure 114's innovative part is the permit to purchase requirement, that that in order to obtain the permit, you not only have to pass a background check, which has been federal law for decades now, but that you also have to be fingerprinted and that you have to complete a firearms training and safety course. Those are what makes Measure 114 kind of more innovative and more restrictive than what other states have at present. And if the Oregon permit to purchase requirements were upheld, I do think you would see other states nationwide be interested in copying the training requirement, the fingerprinting requirement. With regard to the ban on high capacity magazines, Oregon's a little late to the party on this one. That was part of the federal assault weapons ban enacted in 1994 that then lapsed in 2004. And other states, most notably California and Washington, adopted bans on high capacity magazines, and other states nationwide are looking at those. So that part of Measure 114, I don't think Oregon is not going to set the standard there. We'll wait and see what the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit says about California's ban on high capacity magazines, and that decision will largely dictate, at least until the U.S. Supreme Court gets involved, if it does, whether such bans are constitutional or not. My guess, and it is a guess, is that it's going to be weeks, if not months, before any part of Measure 114 goes into effect. This upcoming Friday, the Federal District Court in Portland will hear arguments about a preliminary injunction temporarily preventing Measure 114 from going into effect. It will make its decision, if not Friday, some point in the next few days thereafter, before December 8th. I do think the Federal District Court will say, well, there's no permit process in place, so we can't have people required to follow that. And I think they will also temporarily enjoin the ban on high capacity magazines as well, in light of what the U.S. Supreme Court said in the New York case this past June. That temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction will go into effect pending the district court's proceedings, meaning the district court's going to say, I'm not going to let Measure 114 go into effect while we're conducting argument and briefing here for me, the court, to decide whether it's constitutional or not. And that process is going to take weeks, most likely months. So I don't think anyone in the state should be expecting to see Measure 114 go into effect anytime before next spring or summer at the absolute earliest. but federal district courts often surprise me. So who knows?
What could you explain to me what an emergency motion is?
Sure, and that's a little overly dramatic titling of their motion. This is part of the same lawsuit. So on Friday, November 18th, gun rights supporters filed the lawsuit. And then last Wednesday, they filed what they're calling an emergency motion, asking for the district court to temporarily enjoin Measure 114 from going into effect. And that emergency motion is a motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, asking the court to stop it going into effect while the court proceedings take place. And that motion will be heard by the court this upcoming Friday. And so we'll know a lot more this upcoming Friday or sometime early next week as to exactly what the timeline the federal district court is expecting in terms of how soon it will ultimately decide the ultimate question, which is what parts of Measure 114 are constitutional and which aren't.
The owner of Coat of Arms Firearms, which is the gun store that also was in the process of filing the emergency motion, is suing the Oregon governor and attorney general themselves. Is that part of a strategy to stop Measure 114, or what's the purpose of that specifically?
Well, I don't think we should make too much about that. When you file a lawsuit, you have to name someone as the defendant, as the other party, and the governor and the attorney general of the state are the officers that the state constitution charges with enforcing state law, and so they were the appropriate parties for the gun store owner to name. If there had been another sheriff out there saying, I'm about to enforce 114, starting on December 8th, that sheriff would also have been named in the suit. And so I don't think this is just kind of some of the procedural formalities of federal court litigation that are being obeyed here in naming the governor and the attorney